Hey y'all, welcome to SLP Full Disclosure. I'm your host, Michelle, and today we're going to be kind of bringing to a close the previous episodes that I did on child development. If you listen to those episodes, the birth to 18 months and the 18 to 36 months, you heard me kind of every once in a while talk about what do you do if. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. What are you going to do if? And when I say that, what I mean is, what do you do and how do you develop language in children when you start to see those red flags? And we're going to also talk about what are some red flags that you should be looking for in your child. And I say in your child because I hope that this podcast can reach parents as well as SLPs. So SLPs, we have that background in child development, language development. And I've said previously, it's really important as a speech therapist that we have that knowledge and that background in overall child development and not, definitely in the speech and language and in those milestones. But it's also really important to have an understanding and a good knowledge in those other areas of development as well. And this is really when that becomes important. The reason that's important is because typically you're going to start seeing red flags in children first and foremost in that gross motor area. And so if you know what's typical, then it's easier to spot and identify what's not typical. So when you've got an infant, and I guess we'll kind of go through birth to 18 months. So when you've got an infant and you're looking at those gross motor milestones, that's really the first thing that you're looking for. You're looking for them to be able to hold their head up and learn to roll over and then sit up and then crawl and then walk. So that's kind of the progression of how that gross motor goes along. But with experience, I've also learned from my many amazing physical therapy friends that sometimes when you hold a baby, you can kind of feel some of those things that are not quite right. And when you're looking at development as a speech language pathologist, we're typically not getting those kids. If you're looking at that early intervention setting, we're typically not getting those kids until around 12 months, 15 months, because that's when parents are starting to tell the pediatrician, reach out to their friends and family, hey, he or she is not talking, they're not using words, they're not doing these things. And so that's really when, as speech pathologists, we start coming on board and we start getting involved with this family or with this case, with these children. Parents ask me all the time. I have lots of friends, in my friend group here in Birmingham, we're starting to have babies. I've mentioned that before. My daughter has friends who are starting to have babies. And they always ask me, the first question they ask is, how do I know if something is wrong? So that's kind of really where our focus is going to be today. Typically, I think I've said this before, when I'm working with my early intervention families, I don't like to use that term language delay too soon because sometimes it just takes kids a little bit longer to talk. But when we're working with a family and we as speech pathologists know, okay, this is not a typical late talker. How do we know that this is not a typical late talker? So some of those red flags that you're going to want to start watching for, first and foremost, lack of eye contact. When you call a child's name, if they don't turn and look at you, that's a red flag. Most typically developing children can start to localize to their name or to sounds or their parents' voices very early on. So when you start getting into that 10 to 12 month age range and your child is not looking at you when you call their name or looking at you when you're talking to them, that is a red flag. Something else that is typically present pretty early on that can indicate something is not going in the right direction is a child who is not engaged, lack of engagement. What does that mean? It's a pretty broad term, right? Lack of engagement means not really focusing and playing with toys functionally, purposefully. They're not interested in the toys that light up. They're not interested in the music that's playing. They could either take it or they could leave it. So that lack of what we call in the speech world that joint attention. If you're a parent out there and you've got a child who is not localizing to their name and they're not playing with toys at around 12 months, 10 to 12 months, once they're sitting up and they're starting to walk, that could indicate that something is going on. It doesn't necessarily, and I'm going to say the A word, autism. That's what every parent is always worried about. Do they have autism? And some of these early red flags doesn't always mean that the child is going to be on the autism spectrum. So keep that in mind. Just because they're not doing these things right now doesn't mean that they're not going to be doing them a little bit later on. But as they get a little bit older, eye contact, joint attention, and playing appropriately with toys is very, very important. Early on in my career, I had a lot of experiences with pediatricians, parents going to the pediatrician and expressing concern. Hey, my child's not talking. They're not using words. Maybe at the 2-year checkup, they're not talking. They're not using words. Could something be wrong? And so many times I've seen that get swept under the rug. They'll talk when they're ready. It's okay. They'll talk when they're ready. And in recent years, I have found that pediatricians are much more on top of that. And we're getting a lot more referrals for early intervention, which is getting those services started early, which is vitally important, especially if you've got a child who is not developing typically across all platforms or all domains, platforms. I don't know why I said that. Anyway, over all domains. So, and a lot of times when you have kids who have that lack of engagement and they have very few to no words, you're going to see delays in other areas as well. It's not just going to be with the speech and language. You're going to see fine motor delays. So as your child is learning to feed themselves and doing the finger feeding, can they pick up a Cheerio? Can they pick up a small little block? Can they pick up small things and use that pincer grasp with their thumb and forefinger? If they're not doing that, that is another red flag. As speech pathologists, we are unfortunately sometimes the first professional to come into contact with the family because they've gone to the pediatrician, they've gotten that early intervention referral. They're starting to receive speech and language services, and we're sometimes the first professional to come into their lives that point out what things are, when things are not looking like they're supposed to look, right? And those conversations can be very difficult to initiate and have with families. I know early on in my career, that was one of my biggest fears is when I had a family and I knew in my heart, professionally, I'm looking at this kid. We don't have good eye contact. We don't have good engagement. We're not playing with toys. We're not doing the things that we should be doing at this, 10 to 12 month, 13, 14 month age range. How do I say to a parent, hey, I have concerns? And as a very seasoned speech pathologist who has had more than my share of these conversations with parents, I would encourage the young speech pathologists to be compassionate because this is most likely the first time that a parent is hearing something's not right. And no parent wants to hear that. But also be very honest. We can't predict the future. We don't know what the future holds because almost all 99.9% of the time when I initiate this conversation and I say I have concerns that your child may or may not be on the autism spectrum, keeping in mind that as speech pathologists, we are not able to diagnose autism. But what we can do is we can refer these parents to developmental specialists who are able to make that proper diagnosis of autism. So I always make sure that I let my parents know I'm not diagnosing your child with autism. I'm not able to do that, but I am able to let you know that developmentally, these are things that I'm seeing. I always try to keep my conversations with parents in the initial stages very positive. I try to let them know up front that, hey, I may be wrong, but these are some things that I think that you need to speak with other professionals about as we move through this process in developing this child's language. I have in the past gotten families as old as 2.5, 30 months, 34 months, who are not talking. What do you do then? At this point, you're probably going to have a child who is showing lots and lots of frustration because of the lack of communication. And communication is key. If you can't communicate what you want, what you don't want, what feels good, what doesn't feel good, that's very frustrating, even especially in children. So at that point, we have to go back to the basics. And a lot of times that's really, really hard for parents to do, because another one of those things that's very difficult for those children who are on the spectrum are those basic skills, which we talked about in one of my podcasts about, I think it was a birth to 18 months, that motor imitation piece, that vocal imitation piece of non-speech sounds. If your child is not making noises and is not babbling and is not cooing and squealing and doing that vocal play on their own early on as an infant, that again is a red flag. So we want noisy babies. We want loud babies is what we want. I think that one of the hardest things as a speech pathologist is saying, something's not right. I know something's not right. There have been times in my career where I don't know. I know it doesn't look right, but I'm not really sure what it is. And those cases can be a little bit harder. But I think when you're having these conversations with parents, you need to be open, you need to be honest, and you need to be very specific in what are those things that your child is not doing. I think we've talked about it before, but learning to communicate should not be traumatic. And for some kids, it's hard. It's harder for other kids. It's harder for some kids than it is for other kids. So we want to make sure that we're covering the whole child. Again, going back to that global developmental, looking at all of those areas, gross motor, fine motor, cognitive, all of those things. I've also had families and children that I've worked with in the past that they are using language. They're using lots of language. They're using lots of words early on. So it's not that expressive, but it's the words that they are using. What I mean by that is if we've got a child who is using a lot of echolalia. So for example, you ask the child, do you want a cookie? And the child says, do you want a cookie? A lot of times that gets overlooked by parents because the child is technically talking. They're using lots of words. Do you want to go outside? Go outside. But what they're doing is they're just echoing. They're just imitating what the parent or what the adult or the communication partner is saying to them. There are also children who are very hyper-focused on certain things. Being hyper-focused on one toy, one activity is another really big red flag. If you've got a child who is really into spinning things, I had a child one time that loved helicopters, and he would hold the helicopter and he would just spin the propeller all day long, and that's all he did. Well, that's what you do. That's how you play. So that's not inappropriate play with a toy, but it is hyperfixation on that toy. We all know that the typical red flags are lining things up, making sure everything is in order, putting things in chronological order, sorting things by color. That is typical and atypical. And what I mean by that is when children get closer to 3 and they're 4, they're going to start sorting things by color. That's what we want them to do. That's how they learn their colors, matching things and that sort of thing. When it is a red flag is when it occurs early on and when it seems obsessive, that's all they do. They don't ever stack the blocks. They always sort them. They always line them up. They don't roll their cars on a track or roll them through tunnels or roll them on the floor. They only hold the toy and spin the wheel. That's a red flag. In those situations and with those kids, when they've got a lot of expressive language, they're communicating using sentences, In some cases, they're using language and they know things that they shouldn't know. A 2-year-old or a 3-year-old should not know what a parallelogram is. So if they have skills like that seem to be splinter skills, and what I mean by splinter skills, skills that are outside their developmental age range, those kids we're going to use their strengths as we learn to move through this normal child language development. But that is a lot of times really hard for some parents to hear. But they are talking, but they're repeating cartoons. They're going through a script. They're saying things that they've heard that they hear frequently. Another thing that can be sometimes hard, really hard for parents to pick up on, not so much us as we're speech pathologists because we're trained to listen for these things. Just what does their voice sound like? The prosody of their voice, the pitch of their voice. Are they using a real sing-songy tone of voice? Is their voice really flat, very monotone? Both ends of the spectrum, that high prosody, that sing-songy type of voice, and then that monotone type of voice that you hear with lack of prosody. That is also a red flag. And those are things that sometimes cannot be picked up on and are not observable until they do have a lot of language and a lot more words to communicate. So those are things that we typically see in older kids. Once that language develops, that's what their language sounds like. And I've had families that I've worked with older kids, school-age kids, who have had the really sing-songy type of voice and then the really monotone type of voice, and the parents want me to fix it. They want to do voice therapy. They want to do all of these things to fix it. My philosophy on that is that's who they are. That's what makes them special, and that's what makes them unique. They're communicating. If they are using appropriate sentence length and structure and grammar and all of those things, that's just one thing that makes them special. And I don't like to work on those kinds of things. That might just be a personal, professional judgment on my call. There may be speech pathologists out there who completely disagree with me, and that is completely fine. But I'm thinking of one little boy that I had in Alabama. He was precious, beautiful family, and he had when he talked, it was almost like he was singing. He had a really high-pitched voice, and I remember his mother telling me one time that was her favorite thing about him, is the way he talked and the way he sounded, that she loved his voice. And I thought that was so special, and it just melted my heart because I thought to myself, I've had so many parents in my career say, I need for you to fix that because it makes them sound different. But the fact of the matter is, we are all different. Everyone sounds different, everyone looks different, and that's okay. And when we're working with these kids really early on, we need to remember that these are unique individuals created by God for a very special purpose. And we don't have to fix everything. Our job in the early stages is having those heartfelt, meaningful conversations with families because, like I said, we're the ones who are typically coming in saying something doesn't look right. And we're pointing out all of the things that are red flags. Lack of eye contact. Are they pointing to pictures in a book? Can they follow simple one-step directions? Do they know who people are? Are they interested in interacting? Do they seek reassurance from you when they're upset? Are they overly friendly with strangers? Do they explore new environments when you go out to new places? Are they just generally not interested in playing with age-appropriate toys? And when you do present those age-appropriate toys, are they interacting? Can they do simple turn taking? Are they interested in what you're doing when you're talking to them, when you're singing songs with them, all of the things that we're going to do and when we're developing that language from birth to 36 months? So my philosophy and my therapy techniques do not differ greatly when I am working with a child who has one red flag or 10 red flags. whether they have a diagnosis of autism or whether they don't have a diagnosis of autism. Because the bottom line is, with speech and language development, the first thing they have to be able to do is motor imitation. So that's what I do. My therapy techniques and my strategies are not going to differ. The only thing that might change is the length of time, the type of activities. We're going to have to find things that are engaging and bring that child in and that they want to interact with. So if you've got a child who's not making eye contact, who is showing very low engagement when being spoken to by their parent, and who lacks basic play skills, functional play skills, and they're not playing appropriately, but they love trains, what are we going to use when we're developing that language, when we're trying to bring that child in? We're going to use trains because that's what they're interested in and that's what they love. So we're going to use those trains to go back to the very beginning, and we're going to teach motor imitation. I want you to do with the train what I'm doing with the train. We're going to hold the train up by our face when we call their name, because they're probably going to look at the train, but they're also looking when they hear their name. So we're going to do lots of things like that. But in general, my therapy techniques, and I was thinking about this before I hopped on to record today. Do I do anything differently in my therapy? I don't treat those children any differently. If I've got a child that I get at 2 that has just gotten a diagnosis of autism, I'm not going to treat that child any differently. I'm not going to do any different parent training and parent coaching with that child than I am with a typically developing child. The process that we move through may be different, but the bottom line is that child has to have the same basic prerequisite skills that other children have to have, whether they're on the spectrum or not. It may take them longer to learn those basic skills. We may have to move through those stages at a much slower pace, but that's okay. Because if we skip over any step while we're moving through this language development, it's just going to make it more frustrating for the child and more frustrating for the family and the therapist as well. I've gotten children in kindergarten who have never been diagnosed, that come into school on the first day of school in August, and they walk into the classroom and the teacher just comes running out of the classroom saying, I need help. What's going on? And when I have started working with those children in the past, we have to start from the basics, going back to that motor imitation piece. What are some other red flags as we come to a close? We've talked about the eye contact, the lack of engagement. We've talked about that echolalia, that repetition, because sometimes a red flag can be just overuse of the same phrase. So they may have good expressive language, but are they using functional language? Are they using appropriate phrases? Or are you hearing a lot of echolalia where they're just repeating scripts that they've heard? We've talked about the gross motor. A lot of times that's when the first red flag comes about, is when the child takes a little bit longer to meet those gross motor milestones. I am not saying that all children who are late with gross motor milestones are going to be on the spectrum. Hear me. That is not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that sometimes that can be the start. We've talked about not localizing to their name, the lack of play skills, all of those things that we see in typically developing children. But we've got to take an approach where we are working with families, and it's a little bit easier when you're working in early intervention because you can coach those parents and you can give them that information that they need to work on those skills through daily routines and activities, dressing, bath time, all of those routines that they go through, mealtime during the day. And it's a little bit easier in that situation. But then when you get to school-age kids and you're still seeing these things, and maybe you're the first person to tell a parent that their 5-year-old is possibly on the spectrum and make that referral to the developmental specialist for that diagnosis, those are the tough conversations to have. I think there's been so many advancements and changes in autism diagnosis, autism treatment. We've had our guest, we're going to be releasing a show with Shannon Hill, Dr. Shannon Hill, a BCBA. So just the influx of more professionals in this career and how we approach this behaviorally and cognitively. I think that there are so many things out there now that weren't there many, many years ago. And those kids who were exhibiting those traits or characteristics that were not quite right were sometimes put in classrooms that they didn't need to be in. And so we've had a lot of advancement in how we can approach this and how we can treat children who are on the autism spectrum, especially in relation to that speech and language. We've got augmentative communication. We've got a great guest coming up in the next few weeks, Lynn Roebuck, who is going to be joining us, who is an AAC specialist from Birmingham, Alabama. And so we've got that for those children who may not ever develop verbal speech. So there are lots of things out there that we can do as we're working with our children and with our families. But I think today's podcast, what I want you to take away first and foremost is some of those early red flags, which I think we all are aware of, but also how to approach that family in a gentle, loving, caring way as we start this journey, possibly into a lifetime of things that take a long time, things that are hard. When language is hard, when learning to walk is hard, when fine motor is hard, when cognition is hard, school is hard, sometimes everything is hard. So I think getting these families in early and developing that trust and developing that relationship with them to let them know that it is okay. And there are people out there who are going to walk with you and lead you through this journey from now until this child is an adult. And that we can't predict. I think that's one of the things that I want you to take away is we can't predict what this child's life is going to look like, what their skills are going to be a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. And I think that early on in my career, I kind of put all of those kids who had those red flags, maybe similar red flags, into one bunch. And I was like, well, if this child looked like this at 2, and then I know this child looks like this at 10, then the child next to him is probably going to look the same. And that is not true. All children develop at their own pace, at their own rate. And a lot of it has to do with the interventions that they're receiving, the environments that they're in, and the training that their family has, and what resources are available, unfortunately. So keep that in mind as you're walking these families through these early stages and you're starting to point out. I would not recommend going in, and saying, okay, these are all of the things that your child is doing, and just start naming 5 or 10 or 12 things that they're doing that are red flags that we know. I would pick 1 or 2 to open that door. And at that point, you're going to be able to gauge, how is this family going to accept what I have to say? Because that's going to determine where you go from there. I will say I have had very few families who have gotten upset with me, who have exhibited any kind of resentment or anger toward me. It has happened, but they're very less than one hand. I can count them on. Most families are they're very thankful to have a professional that can help them determine what's going on. Because ultimately, when we're involved, what do they want? They want their child to talk. And most of the time that happens, but sometimes it doesn't. So we have to walk them through each and every phase as we're getting there. If we start talking about augmentative communication, that's very scary. I'm super excited about having Lynn on so that she can walk us through those early stages. But I hope that you have enjoyed today's episode. The red flags, the things that are not quite right, that conversation, that initial conversation is going to be paramount in how that family responds and the way that they are going to accept their child sometimes. And are they going to be open, and are they going to listen, and are they going to seek out other professionals to help you through this journey? So keep that in mind. Open, honest, and heartfelt. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode. And if you have any questions or comments, please reach out and let us know. And until next time, we'll see y'all later. Bye. Thank you for tuning in to SLP Full Disclosure. You can learn more about this episode and our show on our website at amnhealthcare.com. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend and subscribe to our show on your favorite podcast platform. You can also find show updates and SLP opportunities on our Instagram at AMN Allied. Special thanks to AMN Healthcare for making this show possible. See y'all next time.